Welcome to True Crime and Coke. I am your host, Eve, and this podcast is about true crime, disappearances, conspiracies, hauntings, and anything strange or unusual, all while drinking an excessive amount of Diet Coke. If you have a story to share, I would love to hear and feature it on a future episode. Just email me at truecrimeandcoke@gmail.com and put which category it is in the subject line. If you enjoy this podcast and want it to continue, please rate me 5 stars, tell your friends about me, and consider supporting me on Patreon under True Crime and Coke. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin. Welcome to my third episode. Today's episode is a tale of 2 tortures with the victims Junko Furuta and Sylvia Likens. We'll start with Junko Furuta. First, I'll tell you the story about it, and then at the end of her story, then I'll go into detail exactly what she went through. Let's talk about the losers. I'm going to refer to them as A, B, C, D, and E. Loser A was 18 years old. Loser B was 17 years old. Loser C was 16 years old. Loser D was 17 years old. A, B, C, and D went to the same school together, and eventually each one became lazy, or they dropped out of school. They got into shoplifting. One had domestic violence, so they were just a bunch of misfits. So C's house had 2 rooms upstairs, and they were occupied by C and his elder brother, who is E. Their parents worked a lot, so were often not home, and eventually the 2 rooms upstairs became a hangout. Let me tell you about how this group formed. Loser B was in the same grade as E and started to hang out at C and E's house that summer. Then in October 1988, E's motorcycle was stolen, and loser A started to come over to C and E's house to help E search for his motorcycle. And voila, a small gang of violent teenagers formed. Teenager A was feared by the others, and under his leadership, the gang behaved like Yakuza. B was second in command and dominated the others in A's absence. On the evening of November 25th, 1988, Junko Furuta, a beautiful 17-year-old girl, was on her way home from her part-time job, and she was riding her bike. At the same time, A and C were wandering around on separate mopeds with the purpose of snatching bags from or raping young women. Around 8:30 p.m., A and C noticed Junko riding her bike, and they came up with a plan to trick her. One was going to be bad guy, and one was going to be hero. C kicked Junko off of the bike, and he left the scene immediately. She fell to the side. Then A approached her, saying, "That one's crazy. I've been threatened by him with a knife. You will still be in danger. Let me walk you home." Gaining Junko's trust, A lured her into a nearby warehouse where he dropped his pretense and raped her, saying, "I'm his mate and we are both Yakuza. If you obey me, I will spare your life. Let me have sex with you. If you scream, you're dead." He then took her to a hotel by taxi where he raped her again. From the hotel, A rang C's home, their usual hangout, and told B that he succeeded in raping the girl. B asked him to keep her, and at around 3:30 a.m. on November 26th, A, with Junko, B, C, and D met up in a park. After a talk between A and B, they decided to abduct and imprison her. They told her that they knew where she lived from her student notebook, and that they would get Yakuza to kill all of her family if she tried to escape. She was then taken to C's house, where she was easily overpowered and repeatedly gang raped. On November 27th, Junko's worried parents asked the police to search for her. However, the gang forced Junko to call her home 3 times between the end of November and the middle of December. She was made to tell her parents that she had run away from home, was safe with friends, and that she wanted the police search to be stopped. At the beginning of December, when the gang was asleep, Junko rang the police, but was stopped by A before she could say anything. The police immediately phoned back, but A told them it was a mistake. Angered by her act, they started to torture her. She was repeatedly punched, kicked, struck by heavy objects, foreign objects inserted into her private parts, skin burned with cigarette lighters, and they also stopped feeding her. Due to both external and internal injuries and malnutrition, she could hardly walk and had to crawl downstairs to the bathroom. When she could no longer crawl, she was made to urinate into a cup and was forced to drink her own urine. Because of the unbearable violence and pain, Junko repeatedly begged them to kill her. Ignoring her pleas, they continued to torture her for days. The brutality of the attacks changed Junko's appearance completely. Her badly beaten face was so swollen that her cheeks were as high as her nose. Her burned and infected skin produced body fluid with a bad smell. The gang no longer had sexual interest in her, and so to fulfill their sexual desires, at around 2:30 a.m. on December 27th, the 4 abducted a 19-year-old woman on her way home. They pushed her into A's car, threatened her with a knife, took her into a hotel room, and gang raped her. She, however, was not kidnapped like Junko. When January 1989 arrived, the gang talked about ways to kill Junko and get rid of her body, in ways that the police would never find it. In the early hours of January 4th, 1989, after losing a lot of money, A visited D's house. He was frustrated. B and C were also present. After playing computer games for a while, A decided to vent his anger by beating Junko where she lay, barely alive. The attack started at around 8 a.m. Junko was punched, kicked, had her face covered in hot wax with 2 short candles placed on her eyelids, and she hardly responded. They made her stand and struck her face with swinging kicks. Defenseless Junko fell onto a stereo and collapsed. She started a fit of convulsions. The gang knew Junko might die but did not stop. She bled from her nose and mouth, and bloody pus emerged from her burns. Blood spattered all over the room. Reluctant to get blood on his fists, D covered his hands with plastic bags and taped them around the wrists before punching Junko in the stomach and shoulders 20 or 30 times. A, B, and C imitated D and covered their hands in bags also. They took turns to punch and kick Junko in the face, stomach, and thighs. They also struck Junko in the thighs many times with the heavy iron ball, which was part of C's kickboxing exercise machine. D dropped the iron ball onto her stomach several times. A reportedly poured lighter fuel on her thighs and set it alight. Junko initially gestured as if trying to put it off, but gradually became unreactive. The gang taped around Junko's ankle so that she could not escape and went out to a sauna. It is believed that she died in C's room sometime during the last torture or in the hours that followed. The next day, while A, B, and C were out, C's brother E rang to tell them that Junko appeared to be dead. Afraid of the murder being detected, the 3 gang members decided to get rid of Junko's body. They wrapped her body in 2 blankets, pushed it into a large travel bag, and taped around it. From his former employer, A borrowed a cement mixer and a truck and took them to his home. They fetched an oil drum which was used as a litter bin in the neighborhood. They placed the travel bag which contained Junko's body in the drum, threw in some concrete blocks, and filled up the drum with fresh concrete. The drum was taped into a large black litter bag. At around 8 p.m., the drum was loaded onto the truck. They planned to drop it into the sea, but on the way they passed an empty space near a development site and just abandoned it there. On January 23, 1989, A and B were arrested for the gang rape of a 19-year-old woman in December. On March 29th, 2 police officers from the district of where C's house was came to interrogate them. Women's underwear had been found at their addresses, and the police suspected that they might have committed theft as well. There had been a murder of a mother and her 7-year-old son on November 16th the previous year, 9 days before Junko's abduction. As this case had not been solved yet, and it still remains unsolved, by the way. During the interrogation, one officer lightly uttered a trick question to A. "You mustn't kill someone you know." However, A thought that the officer meant the murder of Junko Furuta, thinking that B, in a separate room, had already confessed. "I'm sorry that we killed." The officers were astounded, as it was just a trick. They went to the empty space accordingly to the confession, where they found a drum with a strange smell. The drum was lifted onto a truck by a crane and taken to the police the following day. Junko's body was found in the drum, badly decomposed, as she had been dead for over 2 months. Edema was all over her body. She was malnourished. Facial features were unrecognizable due to severe disfigurement. It had to be identified by fingerprints. On April 1st, C was arrested for another sexual assault and was rearrested for murder. The arrest of D and E followed. Junko Furuta's funeral was held on April 2nd, 1989. So now let's get into the details of it. The thing is, she was tortured for 44 days. Imagine 44 days of that type of torture. So for the beginning of her torture, they made her pretend to be B's girlfriend. And I guess that was so C and E's parents wouldn't be in on it. Days 1 to 11, she was raped a number of 400 times. She was forced to call her parents to tell them that she had ran away and she was starved. She's made to eat cockroaches and drink urine. She was burned with cigarettes and lighters. Fireworks were set off in her ears, mouth, and private parts. Foreign objects were inserted into her private parts. She was beaten a number of times. Day 11 to 20, her face was jumped on a concrete floor, tied up and used as a punching bag, damaging her internal organs, and not being able to breathe out of her nose because it was just filled with so much blood. Dumbbells were dropped onto her stomach, which made her unable to drink water because of the damage to her stomach. She was punished with cigarette burns for trying to escape. Flammable liquid was poured on her legs and set alight. Bottle was inserted into her private parts, causing injury. Day 20 to 30, she was beaten with bamboo sticks. Lit fireworks inserted into her private parts. Her hands were smashed with weights. She was beaten with golf clubs. She was beaten with iron rods. She was forced to sleep outside on the balcony during freezing weather. Skewers of chicken were inserted into her, causing bleeding. Again, her legs were set on fire for trying to escape. Days 30 to 40, her eyelids were burned with a lighter. She was stabbed with sewing needles. Her left nipple was ripped off with pliers. A hot light bulb and scissors were inserted into her vagina. This caused heavy bleeding and left her unable to urinate. The brutality of the attacks drastically altered her appearance. Her face was so swollen that it was difficult to make out her features. Her body was so severely crippled, and she had open sores and infections, giving off a rotting smell that caused the 4 boys to lose their sexual interest in her. That was why the boys went and kidnapped and raped that 19-year-old, who also was, like Furuta, was on her way home from work. On day 44, she was beaten with an iron barbell, kicked and punched. 2 short candles were placed on her eyelids, and it burnt them with the hot wax melting onto them. They made her stand and struck her feet with a swinging stick. This was at the point that she fell onto the stereo and collapsed and went into a fit of convulsions. She was bleeding profusely, and pus was emerging from all of her infected burns. This is when they decided to put plastic bags over their hands and tape them so they wouldn't get blood and pus everywhere. They continued to beat her and dropped an iron exercise ball onto her stomach several times. They poured lighter fluid onto her thighs, arms, face, and stomach, and once again set her on fire. This attack reportedly lasted 2 hours. Furuta eventually succumbed to her wounds that day and died. So that is what happened to that poor girl. I can only imagine, but what I'm about to tell you will make you very upset. Despite the shockingly brutal nature of this crime, the identities of the 4 perpetrators were protected due to all of them being minors at the time of the crime. A, the ringleader, was sentenced to 20 years. His mother sent a big sum of money to Junko's parents after selling their family home. A was released in the summer of 2009. B was sentenced to 5 to 10 years. He was released in August of 1999. C was sentenced to a 5 to 9 year term, and D was sentenced to a 5 to 7 year term. Both are out. C's parents and brother E were not charged. It is also reported that the gang invited others to C's room and let them rape Junko too. They also boasted of having an imprisoned woman for sex. Some said that around 30 youths raped her and about 100 people knew of her imprisonment. Even a young girl once came to see the imprisoned woman and doodled on Junko's face. 29 years later, the 4 perpetrators are free members of society. If alive today, Junko would be 49 years old. The next tale of torture, we are talking about the torture and murder of Sylvia Likens. The murder of Sylvia Likens was a child murder which occurred in Indianapolis, Indiana, in October of 1965. Likens was just 16 when she was held captive and subject to increasing levels of child abuse and torture, committed over a period of almost 3 months by her caregiver, Gertrude Benezewski. Many of Gertrude's children and several other neighborhood children also were involved in the torture. Sylvia died from her injuries on October 26, 1965. So, first off, let's get into the background of Gertrude Benezewski. And yes, I know I'm probably pronouncing the last name wrong, so I'll probably just go by Gertrude B. Gertrude Nadine Fossen was born September 19, 1928, in Indianapolis, Indiana, to Molly Myrtle and Hugh Marcus von Fossen Sr., both of whom were originally from Illinois and were of American and Dutch descent. Gertrude was the third of 6 children, and her family was working class. On October 5, 1939, Gertrude saw her 50-year-old father die from a sudden heart attack. 6 years later, she dropped out of high school at age 16 to marry 18-year-old John Stephen Benezewski. He was originally from Youngsville, Pennsylvania, and she had 4 children with him. Although John had a volatile temper and he occasionally beat Gertrude, the two would remain together for 10 years prior to their first divorce. Following her divorce, Gertrude married a man named Edward Guthrie. This marriage lasted just 3 months before the couple divorced. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude remarried her first husband, giving him 2 more children. Then the couple divorced for a second time in 1963. Weeks after her third divorce, Gertrude began a relationship with a 22-year-old named Dennis Lee Wright, and he also physically abused her. She had 1 child with Wright, and he was named Dennis Lee Wright Jr. But shortly after the birth of his son, Wright abandoned Gertrude. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude filed a paternity suit against Wright for financial support of their child, although Wright was seldom able to pay for the upkeep of their son. So by 1965, Gertrude lived alone with her 7 children, who were Paula, aged 17, Stephanie, aged 15, John, aged 12, Marie, aged 11, Shirley, aged 10, James, aged 8, and Dennis Lee Wright Jr., aged 1. Even though Gertrude was only 36 years old and 5 feet 6 inches tall, she weighed about 100 pounds and was already described as being haggard-looking and underweight and asthmatic. She chain smoked and suffered from depression due to the stress of 3 failed marriages, a failed relationship, and a recent miscarriage. She relied on sporadic checks from her first husband, and she also performed odd jobs for neighbors and acquaintances, such as sewing or cleaning, in order to earn money. The address of residence was 3850 East New York Street, and the rent was $55 a month. Now let's talk about Sylvia. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3rd, 1949. She was the third of 5 children born to carnival workers, Lester Cecil Likens and his wife, Elizabeth Frances. She was born between 2 sets of fraternal twins, Diana and Daniel, and they were 2 years older than her. and Jenny and Benny, who were 1 year younger. Sylvia's sister Jenny had suffered from polio, which caused one of her legs to be weaker than the other, and she had a notable limp, and she had to wear a steel brace on one leg. Lester and Elizabeth's marriage was unstable. They often sold candy, beer, and soda at carnival stands around Indiana throughout the summer, and they moved frequently, and they regularly experienced severe financial difficulties. The Likens sons regularly traveled with their parents in order to help out, but due to concerns for their youngest daughter's safety and education, they didn't particularly like Sylvia and Jenny traveling with them in this employment. Both girls frequently resided with relatives, often their grandmother, so that their schoolwork would not suffer while their parents and brothers traveled with the carnival. In her teenage years, Sylvia Likens occasionally earned spending money by babysitting, running errands, or performing ironing chores for friends and neighbors, and she often gave her mother part of her earnings. She was described as friendly, confident, and lively, with long, wavy, light brown hair that extended below her shoulders. She was known as Cookie to her friends. Likens always kept her mouth closed when smiling due to having lost a front tooth in a collision with one of her brothers during a childhood game. She also had a fondness for music, in particularly the Beatles. She was noted to be protective of her markedly more timid and insecure sister Jenny. On several occasions, the two sisters would visit a local skating rink where Jenny would fasten a single roller skate to her strong foot, and Sylvia would lead her by the hand as they skated around the rink. By June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Likens resided with their parents in Indianapolis. On July 3rd, their mother was arrested and subsequently jailed for shoplifting. Shortly thereafter, Lester Likens arranged for his daughters to board with Gertrude. As the sisters knew Gertrude's daughters, Paula and Stephanie, they attended the same high school. The understanding was that Gertrude would receive weekly boarding fees of $20 to care for Sylvia and Jenny, and that she would treat them like her own daughters until they were picked up by their parents, which was planned to be in November of that year. During the initial weeks that Sylvia and Jenny were at Gertrude's house, they were subjected to very little abuse and discipline. They had a good time. They participated in housework. They attended Sunday school with Gertrude's children, and it all seemed like it was going just fine until the $20 a week payment for an exchange of the care of Jenny and Sylvia started becoming later and later. This resulted in Gertrude venting her frustration out on this fact upon Jenny and Sylvia. She beat their bare buttocks with various instruments, such as a 1/4 inch thick paddle, making statements such as, "Well, I took care of you two little bitches a week for nothing." On one occasion in late August, both girls were beaten approximately 15 times on the back with the paddle because Paula had accused them of eating too much food at a church supper the household children had attended. By mid-August 1965, Gertrude had begun to focus her abuse almost exclusively upon Sylvia, with her primary motivation likely being jealous of her physical appearance. The abuse was inflicted upon Sylvia after school and on weekends. The abuse included subjecting Likens to beatings and being refused sufficient food. This would gradually lead to Likens eating leftovers or spoiled food out of garbage cans. On one occasion, Sylvia was accused of stealing candy that she had actually purchased. And on another occasion, in late August, Sylvia was subjected to humiliation when she claimed to have a boyfriend in Long Beach, whom she had met in the spring of 1965 when her family lived in California. In response to hearing this, Gertrude asked if she had ever done anything with a boy, to which Sylvia replied, "I guess so," unsure of her mating, and offered that she had gone skating with boys there and once went to a park on the beach with them and Jenny. Sylvia mentioned that she had once lain under the covers with her boyfriend. When Gertrude heard this, she asked, "Why did you do that, Sylvia?" Sylvia replied, "I don't know," and shrugged. Several days later, Gertrude returned to the subject with Sylvia, telling her, "You're certainly getting big in the stomach, Sylvia. It looks like you're going to have a baby." But Sylvia only thought she was kidding and responded, "Yeah, it sure is getting big. I'm just going to have to go on a diet." However, Gertrude then informed her and the other girls in the house that whenever they did something with the boy, that they would be sure to have a baby. She then kicked Sylvia in the genitals. Paula now joined in, knocking Sylvia off her chair and onto the kitchen floor. She scolded, "You ain't fit to sit in a chair." On another occasion, as the family ate supper, Gertrude, Paula, and a neighborhood boy named Randy Gordon Lepper force-fed Sylvia a hot dog overloaded with condiments, including mustard, ketchup, and spices. Sylvia vomited as a result and was later forced to consume what she had vomited. In what would be Sylvia's only act of retaliation, she did spread a rumor at the high school that Stephanie and Paula were prostitutes. She did this because she was upset with the household singling her out for similar accusations. While at school, Stephanie was jokingly propositioned by a boy who told her that Sylvia had started the rumor about her. Upon returning home that day, Stephanie questioned Sylvia about the rumor, and she admitted to starting it. Stephanie punched her in response, but Sylvia did apologize to her in tears, and Stephanie then also began to cry. But when Stephanie's boyfriend, 15-year-old Coy Hubbard, heard about the rumor, he brutally attacked Sylvia. He slapped her, banged her head against the wall, and flipped her backwards onto the floor. Then when Gertrude found out, she used the paddle to beat Sylvia. On another occasion, Paula beat Sylvia about the face with such force that she broke her own wrist, having primarily focused her blows upon Likens' teeth and eyes. Later, Paula used the cast on her broken wrist to further beat Sylvia. Gertrude repeatedly falsely accused Sylvia of promiscuity and of engaging in prostitution, and would deliver misogynistic sermons to Sylvia regarding the filthiness of prostitution and of women in general. Gertrude would later occasionally force Jenny to strike her own sister, beating Jenny if she did not comply. Coy Hubbard and several of his classmates frequently visited Gertrude's household. They physically and verbally tormented Sylvia, often collaborating with Gertrude's children and Gertrude herself. With the active encouragement of Gertrude, these neighborhood children routinely beat Sylvia, sometimes using her as a practice dummy in violent judo sessions, lacerating her body, burning her skin with lit cigarettes in excess of 100 times, and severely injuring her genitals. To entertain Gertrude and her teenage accomplices, Sylvia was forced at one point to strip naked in the family living room and insert an empty Coca-Cola bottle into her own vagina in their presence, with Gertrude stating to all present this act of humiliation being for Sylvia to prove to Jenny what kind of girl you are. And sorry for the background noise, I just fed my dogs and they are chowing down and moving their bowls all around, so that's what that noise is. Gertrude refused to buy Sylvia clothing, so Sylvia stole a gym suit from the school. After she confessed to it, Gertrude stopped letting her go to school and then whipped her with a 3-inch wide place belt. Gertrude then switched her conversation to the evils of premarital sex before repeatedly kicking Sylvia in the genitals. Stephanie rallied to Sylvia's defense, shouting, "She didn't do anything." Gertrude then burned Sylvia's fingertips with matches before further whipping her. A few days later, Gertrude reportedly whipped Jenny with the police belt after she reportedly stole a single tennis shoe from the school to wear on her strong foot. Jenny and Sylvia were fearful of notifying family members or any adults at their school because they feared that the abuse would be worse, and Jenny was also threatened that her abuse would be as bad as Sylvia's if she told anybody. Jenny was also subjected to bullying by girls in her neighborhood, and occasionally being ridiculed or beaten whenever she alluded to Sylvia's situation. Occasionally, Elizabeth and Lester Likens would return to Indianapolis to visit their daughters when they were able to. The very last time they visited their daughters was in late August, and on this occasion, neither girl exhibited any visible signs of distress about their mistreatment to their parents, but this was likely because both were in the presence of Gertrude and her children. Almost immediately after Lester and Elizabeth had left Gertrude's house, Gertrude turned to face Sylvia and stated, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia? Now they're gone." On one occasion in September, the girls encountered their older sister, Diana Shoemaker, at a local park. They told her about the abuse they were enduring and that Sylvia had it the worst. However, they did not tell her the exact address of where they lived, and Diana also believed that her sisters were probably exaggerating the claims. And several weeks before this occasion, Sylvia and Jenny also ran into Diana in the same park. They were in the company of Gertrude's 11-year-old daughter, Marie. Sylvia had been given a sandwich to eat when she had mentioned to her sister that she was hungry. Sylvia remained silent about the matter, although Marie revealed this fact to her family in late September. In response, Gertrude accused Sylvia of engaging in gluttony before she and Paula choked and bludgeoned her. The pair then subjected Sylvia to a scalding bath to cleanse her of sin. And then Gertrude would grab Sylvia's hair and bang her head repeatedly against the bath to revive her when she fainted. Shortly after this incident, the father of a neighborhood boy named Michael John Monroe phoned the high school to anonymously report that a girl with open sores across her entire body was living at the Gertrude house. As Sylvia had not attended school for several days, a school nurse visited this house to investigate the claims. Gertrude claimed to the nurse that Sylvia had run away from her home the previous week and that she was unaware of her actual whereabouts, adding that Sylvia was out of control and that her open sores were a result of Sylvia's refusal to maintain decent personal hygiene. Gertrude further exclaimed that Sylvia was a bad influence on both her own children and her sister. The school made no further investigations in relation to Sylvia's welfare. The immediate neighbors of Gertrude's family were a middle-aged couple named Raymond and Phyllis Vermillion. Both initially viewed Gertrude as an ideal caregiver for the Likens sisters, and both had visited Gertrude's house on 2 occasions when the girls had been under Gertrude's care. On both occasions, the Vermillions witnessed Paula physically abusing Sylvia, who on both occasions had a black eye, and openly boasting about her mistreatment of the child to them. Upon their second visit to Gertrude's house, they both observed Sylvia appearing extremely meek and somewhat zombified in nature, but the Vermillions never reported Sylvia's evident mistreatment to the authorities. Jerks. Around October 1st, Diana Shoemaker, Sylvia and Jenny's sister, discovered that her sisters were temporarily residing at the Gertrude residence. She visited the property in an attempt to initiate regular contact. Gertrude, however, refused Diana entrance to her property, stating that she had received permission from their parents not to allow either girl to see her. She then ordered Diana off her property. Approximately 2 weeks later, Diana encountered Jenny close to the residence and asked how Sylvia was doing. However, Jenny told her she can't tell her or she'll get into trouble. The increase in the frequency and brutality of the torture and mistreatment that Sylvia was subjected to caused her to become incontinent. She was denied any access to the bathroom and forced to wet herself. As a form of punishment for her incontinence, on October 6th, Gertrude simply threw Sylvia into the basement and tied her up. Here, Sylvia was often kept naked, rarely fed, and frequently deprived of water. Occasionally, she would be tied to the railing of the basement stairs in a torture rack fashion with her feet scarcely touching the ground. In the weeks prior to locking Sylvia in the family basement, Gertrude made it a family thing to abuse and torment Sylvia. She would make false claims to the other children in her household to rile them up and get them to abuse her. On one occasion, Gertrude held a knife and challenged Sylvia to fight me back, and Sylvia replied that she did not know how to fight. In response, Gertrude inflicted a light scour wound to Likens' leg. Sometimes the physical and mental torment would be paused, so Gertrude and her family could watch their favorite television shows. And get this, the neighborhood children would sometimes pay 5 cents apiece to see the display of Sylvia's body and to humiliate, beat, scald, burn, and ultimately mutilate her. Throughout the period of Sylvia's captivity in the basement, Gertrude frequently, with the assistance of her children and their friends, they would restrain Likens before placing her in a bathtub, and they filled it with scalding water before proceeding to rub salt into her wounds. And in order to muffle Sylvia's screams and pleas for mercy, her tormentors would regularly place a cloth gag in her mouth as they tortured her. On one occasion, Gertrude and her 12-year-old son, John Jr., rubbed urine and feces from Gertrude's 1-year-old son's diaper into Sylvia's mouth before giving her a cup half filled with water and stating the water was all she would receive for the remainder of the day. On October 22nd, John Jr. tormented Sylvia by offering to allow her to eat a bowl of soup with her fingers, But then he quickly took away the food when Sylvia, by this stage, was suffering from extreme malnourishment, attempted to eat the food. Gertrude eventually allowed Sylvia to sleep upstairs, on the condition that she learned not to wet herself. That night, Sylvia whispered to Johnny to secretly give her a glass of water before falling asleep. The following morning, Gertrude discovered that Sylvia had urinated herself. As a punishment, Sylvia was forced to masturbate with an empty glass Coca-Cola bottle in the presence of Gertrude's children. Then Sylvia was ordered to go down into the basement. Shortly after, Gertrude shouted for Sylvia to return to the kitchen, then ordered her to strip naked and proclaimed to her, "You have branded my daughters, now I'm going to brand you." She began carving the words, "I am a prostitute and proud of it," onto Sylvia's abdomen with a heated needle. When Gertrude was unable to finish the branding, she instructed one of the neighborhood children present, 14-year-old Richard Hobbs, to finish etching the words into Sylvia's flesh as she took Jenny to a nearby grocery store. And what Hobbs would later insist were short light etchings. He continued to brand the text into Sylvia's abdomen as she clenched her teeth and moaned. Both Hobbs and 10-year-old Shirley then led Sylvia into the basement, where each proceeded to use an anchor bolt in an attempt to burn the letter S beneath Sylvia's left breast, although they applied one section of the loop backwards, and this deep burn scar would resemble the numeral 3. Gertrude later taunted Sylvia by claiming she would never be able to marry due to the words carved on her stomach, stating, "Sylvia, what are you going to do now? You can't get married now. What are you going to do?" Weeping, Sylvia replied, "I guess there's nothing I can do." She was then carried back to the basement by Coy Hubbard, and later that day Sylvia was forced to display the carving to neighborhood children, and Gertrude exclaimed that she had received the inscription at a sex party. That night, Sylvia told her sister, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it." The next day, Gertrude had an idea. She made Sylvia write a letter, and she dictated what to say. The content of this letter was intended to make her parents think that she ran away and to frame a group of anonymous local boys for extensively abusing and mutilating her after she agreed to engage in sexual relations with them before they inflicted the extreme abuse and torture upon her body. After Sylvia wrote this letter, Gertrude finished formulating her plan to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia, then take her to a nearby wooded area known as Jimmy's Forest and simply leave her there to die. After writing the letter, Sylvia was then again tied to the stair railing and offered crackers to eat, although she refused them, saying, "Give it to the dog, I don't want it." In response, Gertrude forced the crackers into Sylvia's mouth before she and John beat her, particularly about the stomach. On October 25th, Sylvia attempted to escape from the basement after overhearing a conversation between Gertrude and John Jr. pertaining to the family's plan to simply abandon her to die. She attempted to flee to the front door, but due to her extensive injuries and weakness, Gertrude caught her before she could escape the property. Sylvia was then given toast to eat, but she was unable to consume the food due to her extreme state of dehydration. Gertrude forced the toast into her mouth before repeatedly striking her face with the curtain rod until sections of the instrument were bent into right angles. Coy Hubbard then took the curtain rod from Gertrude and struck Sylvia one further time, which caused her to go unconscious. Gertrude then dragged Sylvia into the basement. That evening, Sylvia desperately attempted to alert neighbors by screaming for help and hitting the walls of the basement with a spade. One of Gertrude's immediate neighbors would later inform police that she had heard the desperate commotion and that she had identified the source as coming from the basement of Gertrude's house, but that the noise just suddenly stopped at around 3 a.m., and then she decided not to inform the police about the disturbance. By the morning of October 26th, Sylvia was unable to either speak intelligibly or to correctly coordinate the movement of her limbs. Gertrude did move Sylvia into the kitchen, having propped her back against a wall, and attempted to feed her a donut and a glass of milk. But she threw Sylvia back to the floor in frustration when she was unable to correctly move the glass of milk to her lips. She was then taken back to the basement. Shortly thereafter, Sylvia became delirious, repeatedly moaning and mumbling. When Paula asked her to recite the English alphabet, Sylvia was unable to recite anything beyond the first 4 letters or to raise herself off of the ground. In response, Paula verbally threatened her to stand up or she would herself inflict a long jump upon her. Gertrude then ordered Sylvia, who had pooped herself, to clean up herself. That afternoon, several of Sylvia's other tormentors gathered in the basement. Sylvia jerkingly moved her arms in an apparent attempt to point at the faces of the tormentors she could recognize, making statements such as, "You're Ricky," and "You're Gertie." And then Gertrude tersely shouted, "Shut up! You know who I am." Minutes later, Sylvia unsuccessfully attempted to bite into a rotten pear she had been given to eat, stating she could feel the looseness in her teeth. Upon hearing this, Jenny replied, "Don't you remember, Sylvia? Your front tooth was knocked out when you were 7. Jenny then left Sylvia in the basement to perform gardening chores for neighbors in the hope of earning spending money. In an attempt to wash Sylvia, John Jr. sprayed her with a garden hose that was brought into the house by Randy at Gertrude's request. Sylvia again desperately attempted to exit the basement but collapsed before she could reach the stairs. In response to this effort, Gertrude stamped upon Sylvia's head before standing and staring at her for several moments. Stephanie then decided to give Sylvia a warm, soapy bath. But Sylvia stopped breathing before she could even be carried out of the basement. She was only 16 years old. When Stephanie realized that Sylvia was not breathing, she attempted to apply mouth-to-mouth resuscitation as Gertrude repeatedly shouted her belief to the children and teenagers present in her house that Sylvia was simply faking her death. After 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs returned to Gertrude's residence and went to the basement. He slipped on the wet basement stairs and he fell to the floor of the basement to be confronted with the sight of Stephanie crying and cuddling Sylvia's emaciated and lacerated body. When Gertrude finally accepted that efforts made to revive Sylvia by bathing her and her own efforts of twice striking Sylvia's face with a book to revive her were unsuccessful, she instructed Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. When police arrived at her address at around 6:30 p.m., Gertrude led the officers to Sylvia's emaciated, bludgeoned, and mutilated body lying upon a soiled mattress in one of the bedrooms. She then handed them the letter that she forced Sylvia to write earlier, and she also claimed that she had been doctoring Sylvia for about an hour prior to her death and had applied rubbing alcohol to her wounds in an attempt to first aid before she died. She also added that Sylvia had earlier run away from her home with several teenage boys before returning to her house earlier that afternoon, bare-breasted and clutching the note. Clutching a Bible, Paula having stated to all present in the household that Sylvia's death was meant to happen, she glanced in Jenny's direction and calmly stated, "If you want to live with us, Jenny, we'll treat you like our own sister." As previously instructed by Gertrude, Jenny recited the rehearsed version of events leading to Sylvia's death that afternoon to the police. But she also whispered to the officers, "You get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The formal statement provided by Jenny prompted officers to arrest Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Jr. on suspicions of Sylvia's murder within hours of the discovery of her body. The same day, Coey Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same offenses. Gertrude's oldest 3 children, plus Coey Hubbard, were placed in the custody of a nearby juvenile detention center. Gertrude's younger children and Richard Hobbs were detained at the Indianapolis Children's Guardian Home. All were held without bail pending trial. At first, Gertrude denied any involvement in Sylvia's death, but by October 27th, she did confess to knowing that the kids, particularly her daughter Paula and Coey Hubbard, had physically and emotionally abused Sylvia. Gertrude further admitted to having forced the girl to sleep in the basement on about 3 occasions when she had wet the bed. Gertrude became evasive when the officer suggested that the likely reason Sylvia had become incontinent were her mental distress and injury to her kidneys. 5 other neighborhood children who had participated in Sylvia's abuse, Michael Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Duke, and Anna Sisko, had also been arrested by October 29th. All were charged with causing injury to person, and each was subsequently released into the custody of their parents under subpoena to appear as witnesses at the upcoming trial. An autopsy was done on Sylvia. It revealed that she had suffered in excess of 150 separate wounds across her entire body, in addition to being extremely emaciated at the time of her death. The wounds themselves varied in location, nature, severity, and the actual stage of healing. Her injuries included burns, severe bruising, and extensive muscle and nerve damage. Her vaginal cavity was almost swollen shut, and an examination of the canal determined that her hymen was still intact. The autopsy discredited Gertrude's assertion that Sylvia had been 3 months pregnant, a prostitute, and promiscuous. Also, Sylvia's fingernails were broken backwards, and most of the external layers of her skin upon her face, breasts, neck, and right knee had been peeled or receded. In her death throes, Sylvia had evidently bitten through her lips, partially severing sections of them from her face. The official cause of Sylvia's death was listed by coroner Dr. Arthur Keble as subdural hematoma due to her receiving a severe blow to her right temple. Both the shock she had primarily suffered due to the severe and prolonged damage inflicted to her skin and subcutaneous tissues, plus the severe malnutrition, were listed as contributory factors to her death. Rigor mortis had fully developed at the time of the discovery of her body, indicating Sylvia may have been deceased for up to 8 hours before she was found. Although Dr. Keble did note that Sylvia had been recently bathed, possibly after death, and this act could have hastened the loss of body temperature and thus speeding the onset of rigor mortis. Sylvia Likens was laid to rest on October 29th. The casket remained open throughout the ceremony, and a portrait taken of her prior to July 1965 was by her coffin. She is buried in Oak Hill Cemetery, and her headstone is inscribed with the words, "Our darling daughter." On December 30th, 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury returned first-degree murder indictments against Gertrude Benezewski and 2 of her 3 oldest children, Paula and John Benezewski Jr. Also indicted were Richard Hobbs and Coe Hubbard. All were charged with having repeatedly struck, beaten, kicked, and otherwise inflicting a culmination of fatal injuries to Sylvia Likens with premeditated malice. 3 weeks prior to the filing of the indictment against the 5 defendants, Stephanie Benezewski's attorney was able to get her out on bond due to insufficient evidence to support any murder or culmination of fatal injuries charges against her. Stephanie waived her immunity from any potential impending prosecution while agreeing to testify against her family and any other individuals charged with abusing and murdering Sylvia. The trial of Gertrude, her children Paula and John, Richard Hobbs, and Coe Hubbard began on April 18, 1966. All were tried together. Gertrude pleaded not guilty for reason of insanity, and Coe Hubbard, Richard Hobbs, Paula, and John Benezewski Jr. claimed they had been pressured into participating in Sylvia's torment and abuse and torture by Gertrude. One of the first witnesses to testify on behalf of the prosecution was Deputy Coroner Charles Ellis, who testified on April 29th to the intense pains Sylvia had suffered, stating that her fingernails were broken backwards, numerous deep cuts and punctures covered much of her body, and that her lips were essentially in shreds due to her having repeatedly bitten and chewed upon them. Ellis further testified that Sylvia had been in an acute state of shock for between 2 and 3 days prior to her death, and that she may have been in too advanced of a state of shock to offer much resistance to any form of subjected treatment in her final hours, although he did emphasize that aside from the extensive swelling around her genitalia, Sylvia's body bore no evidence of sexual molestation. On May 2nd and 3rd, Jenny Likens testified against all 5 defendants, stating that each had repeatedly and extensively both physically and emotionally abused her sister, adding that Sylvia had done nothing to provoke the assaults and that there had been no truth in either the rumors she had been falsely accused of spreading or the slurs each had made against Sylvia's character. Jenny testified that Sylvia's abuse, and to a much lesser degree her own abuse, started about 2 weeks after they began to live in Gertrude's house, and that the abuse of Sylvia escalated. Sylvia had occasionally been unable to produce tears due to her acute state of dehydration. Jenny burst into tears as she recalled how, just days before Sylvia died, she had said to her, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I am going to die. I can tell it." Sections of Jenny Likens' testimony were later corroborated by that of Randy Lepper, who stated he had once witnessed Sylvia crying, but that she shed no actual tears. Lepper then visibly smirked as he confessed to having beaten Sylvia on anywhere between 10 and 40 separate instances. On May 10th, a Baptist minister named Roy Julian testified to having known a teenage girl was being abused in Gertrude's household, but he failed to report this information to authorities as he was informed by Gertrude that Sylvia had made advances to men for money. He had believed the girl was being punished for soliciting. The same day, 13-year-old Judy Duke also testified, admitting to having witnessed Sylvia once endure salt being rubbed into sores upon her legs until she screamed. Duke also testified to one occasion where she witnessed 10-year-old Shirley rip open Sylvia's blouse, to which Richard Hobson made the casual remark, "Everybody's having fun with Sylvia." The following day, Gertrude testified in her own defense. She denied any responsibility for Sylvia's prolonged abuse, torment, and death, claiming her children and other children within her neighborhood must have committed the acts within her home, which she described as being such a madhouse. She also added that she had been too preoccupied with her own ill health and depression to control her own children. In response to questioning relating to whether she had physically abused the Likens sisters, Gertrude claimed that although she had started to spank Sylvia on one occasion, she was emotionally unable to finish doing so and had not hit the child on any further occasion. She denied any knowledge of Sylvia having even endured any beating, scalding, branding, or burning within her home. 2 days later, Richard Hobbs testified in his own defense, describing how Gertrude told Sylvia to come to the kitchen on October 23rd and stated to her, "You have branded my children, so now I'm going to brand you." Hobbs testified Gertrude had begun etching the insult into Sylvia's abdomen before asking him to finish the task. Although Hobbs testified this act of branding had brought blood to the surface of Sylvia's flesh and that she begged him to stop, he remained adamant that the section of branding he had inflicted had been light. Hobbs further testified that he had initially believed Sylvia would not be at Gertrude's household on October 26th, as Gertrude had informed him she intended to get rid of Sylvia the day prior. When Marie was called to the stand as a witness for the defense, she broke down and admitted that she had heated the needle which Hobbs had used to brand Sylvia's abdomen. Marie also testified as to her mother's indifference to Sylvia's evident distress in relation to the physical and mental abuse she had increasingly suffered with her mother's full knowledge, stating that on one occasion, Gertrude had simply sat upon a chair and crocheted as she watched a neighborhood girl named Anna Cisco attack Sylvia. Marie added that although all 5 defendants had reportedly physically and mentally tormented Sylvia, she had most often witnessed her mother and sister committing these acts, before her mother had forced Sylvia to live in the basement where the abuse had further escalated and where she had ultimately died. Another witness to testify on behalf of the prosecution was Grace Sargent. She stated how she had sat close to Paula on a church bus and had heard her openly bragging about breaking her own wrist due to the severity of a beating she had inflicted to Sylvia's face on August 1st. Sargent testified that Paula had finished her boasting by stating, "I tried to kill her." On May 16th, a court-appointed doctor named Dwight Schuster testified on behalf of the prosecution. When questioned by Leroy New as to the exhaustive interviews and assessments he had conducted with Gertrude, she had been evasive and uncooperative. Dr. Schuster testified as to his belief that Gertrude was sane and fully in control of her actions, adding that she had been sane in October 1965 and remained sane to this date. Dr. Schuster was subjected to over 2 hours of intense cross-examination by Gertrude's lawyer, William Erkberger, although he remained steadfast that Gertrude was not and had never been psychotic. Deputy Prosecutor Marjorie Wessner delivered the state's closing argument before the jury on behalf of the prosecution. As each defendant except Richard Hobbs, whose head dropped into his lap, remained impassive, Wessner recounted the continuous mistreatment that Sylvia had endured before her death, emphasizing that at no point had Sylvia either provoked any of the defendants or received any medical care beyond occasionally having margarine rubbed into scalded sections of her face and body. Referencing specific forms and means of abuse and neglect at the defendant's hands and their collective failure to either help Sylvia or deter each other from mistreating her, Wessner described Sylvia's abuse as stomach-wrenching and compared to her treatment at the hands of all 5 defendants as being the equivalent in severity to that committed against prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. Wessner also stated that there was practically no fat on Sylvia's body. She hadn't eaten for a week. She said, "We'll never know the pain and suffering that Sylvia endured, and the best evidence of that was the picture of her lips that were bitten into shreds." The trial of the 5 defendants lasted 17 days. On May 19, 1966, after deliberating for 8 hours, the panel of 8 men and 4 women found Gertrude guilty of first-degree murder, recommending a sentence of life imprisonment. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder. Hobbs, Hubbard, and John Jr. were found guilty of manslaughter. Upon hearing Judge Rabb pronounce the verdicts, Gertrude and her children burst into tears and attempted to console each other as Hobbs and Hubbard remained impassive. On May 25th, Gertrude and Paula were formally sentenced to life imprisonment. The same day, Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Jr. each received sentences of 2 to 21 years to be served in the Indiana Reformatory. In September 1970, the Indiana Supreme Court reversed the convictions of Gertrude and Paula on the basis that Judge Rabb had denied repeatedly submitted motions by their defense at the original trial for both a change of venue and separate trials. This ruling further stated that the circumstances regarding the prejudicial atmosphere created during their initial trial, due to the extensive news media publicity surrounding the case, impeded any chance of either appellant receiving a fair trial. The pair were retried in 1971, and on this occasion, Paula opted to plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter rather than face a retrial. She was sentenced to serve a term of between 2 and 20 years imprisonment for her part in Sylvia's abuse and death. Despite twice unsuccessfully having attempted to escape from prison in 1971, she was released in December of 1972. Gertrude, however, was again convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Over the course of the following 14 years, Gertrude became known as a model prisoner at the Indiana Women's Prison. She worked in the prison sewing shop and was known as somewhat of a den mother to younger female inmates, becoming known to some within the prison by the nickname Mom. By the time of Gertrude's ultimate parole in 1985, she had changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen, which was a combination of her middle name and maiden name. She also described herself as a devout Christian. During her parole hearing, Gertrude stated that she wished that Likens' death could be undone, although she minimized her responsibility for any of her actions, stating, "I'm not sure what role I had in Sylvia's death because I was on drugs. I never really knew her. I take full responsibility for whatever happened to Sylvia." Following her 1985 release from prison, Gertrude relocated to Iowa. She never accepted full responsibility for being the ultimate architect in Sylvia's prolonged torment and ultimate death, insisting she was unable to precisely recall any of her actions in the months of Sylvia's prolonged and increasing abuse and torment within her home. She primarily blamed her actions upon the medication she had been prescribed to treat her asthma. Gertrude lived in a relative obscurity in Laurel, Iowa, until her death due to lung cancer on June 6, 1990, at the age of 61. Following her 1972 parole, Paula assumed a new identity. She worked as an aide to a school counselor for 14 years at the Iowa Conrad Liscum Union-Winton School District. She changed her name to Paula Pace, and she concealed the truth regarding her criminal history to the school district when she applied for the position. She was fired in 2012 when the school discovered her true identity. Paula reportedly lives in a small town in Iowa. She is married and has 2 children. The baby daughter that she had given birth to while being tried in 1966 and that she named after her mother was later adopted. The murder charges initially filed against Stephanie were ultimately dropped after she agreed to turn state's evidence against the other defendants. Although prosecutors did resubmit their case against Stephanie before a grand jury on May 26, 1966, the decision to later prosecute her in a separate trial never materialized. Stephanie assumed a new name and became a school teacher. She later remarried and has several children. Stephanie Sargent currently lives in Florida. Following the arrest of their mother, Marion County Department of Public Welfare placed Marie, Shirley, and James in the care of separate foster families. The surname of all three children was legally changed to Blake in the late 1960s after their father regained their custody. Marie later married. Marie Shelton died of natural causes on June 8, 2017 at the age of 62. Dennis Lee Wright Jr. was later adopted. His adopted mother named him Denny Lee White. He died on February 5, 2012 at the age of 47. Richard Hobbs, Coey Hubbard, and John Jr. each served less than 2 years in the Indiana Reformatory before being granted parole on February 27, 1968. Richard Hobbs died of lung cancer on January 2, 1972 at the age of 21, 4 years after his release from the Indiana Reformatory. In the years between his release from the Indiana Reformatory and his death, he is known to have suffered at least one nervous breakdown. Following his 1968 release from the Indiana Reformatory, Coey Hubbard remained in Indiana and never attempted to change his name. Throughout his adult life, Hubbard was repeatedly imprisoned for various criminal offenses, on one occasion being charged with the 1977 murders of 2 young men, although largely due to the fact that the chief witnesses to testify at his trial had been convicted criminal acquaintance of Hubbard's, who admitted to having been in his company at the time of the murders. He was acquitted of this charge. Shortly after the January 2007 premiere of the crime drama film An American Crime, Hubbard was fired from his job. He died of a heart attack in Shelbyville, Indiana on June 23rd of that year at the age of 56. An American Crime is a movie about this case. John Jr. lived in relative obscurity under the alias John Blake. He became a lay minister, frequently hosting counseling sessions to the children of divorced parents. Several decades after his release from the Indiana Reformatory, John Jr. issued a statement in which he acknowledged the fact that he and his co-defendants should have been sentenced to a more severe term of punishment, adding that young criminals are not beyond rehabilitation, and described how he had become a productive citizen. He died of diabetes in the Lancaster General Hospital on May 19, 2005 at the age of 52. Prior to his death, he had also occasionally spoken publicly about his past, readily admitting he had enjoyed the attention from Sylvia's murder brought upon him and also claiming to have only ever hit Sylvia once. The injury to person charges brought against the other juveniles known to have actively physically, mentally, and emotionally tormented Sylvia, who were Ann Ruth Sisko, Judy Darlene Duke, Michael John Monroe, Darlene McGuire, and Randy Gordon Lepper, were later dropped. Sisko ultimately married but died on October 23, 1996, at the age of 44, already being a grandmother, and Lepper, who had visibly smirked at the testimony, having hit Likens up to 40 separate occasions, died at the age of 56 on November 14, 2010. Jenny Likens later married an Indianapolis native named Leonard Reese Wade. The couple had 2 children. She died of a heart attack on June 23, 2004 at the age of 54. At the time of her death, Jenny resided in Beech Grove, Indiana. 14 years prior to her death, Jenny Likens Wade had viewed Gertrude's obituary in a newspaper. She clipped the section from the newspaper, then mailed it to her mother with a note simply reading, "Some good news. Damn old Gertrude died. Ha ha ha. I am happy about that." Elizabeth and Lester Likens died in 1998 and 2013. In the years prior to her own death, Jenny Likens Wade had repeatedly emphasized no blame should be placed upon either of her parents for placing her and Sylvia in the care of Gertrude, stating all her parents had done was trust Gertrude's promise to actually care for them until their return to Indiana with the traveling carnival. The house at 3850 East New York Street, in which Likens was tortured and murdered, stood vacant for many years after her death and the arrest of her tormentors. The property gradually became dilapidated. Although discussions were held in relation to the possibility of purchasing it and fixing it up to convert into a women's shelter, but the necessary funds to complete this project were never raised. The house itself was demolished on April 23, 2009. The site where 3850 East New York Street once stood is now a church parking lot. In June 2001, a 6-foot-tall granite memorial was formally dedicated to Sylvia Likens' life and legacy in Willard Park on Washington Street, Indianapolis. This dedication was attended by several hundred people, including members of the Likens family. The memorial itself is inscribed with these words: "This memorial is in memory of a young child who died a tragic death. As a result, laws changed and awareness increased. This is a commitment to our children that the Indianapolis Police Department is working to make this a safe city for our children." That is all for my third episode, which it was 2 tales of torture. Junko Furuta and Sylvia Likens, young girls that did not deserve any of that, and losers who got away. I will post pictures on my Patreon page, and please consider supporting me. My plan is to not have any ads ever, so hopefully that can happen with Patreon support. So anyway, please forgive me for all the sounds in the background as I am quarantined and my family's home making noises, and especially my dogs, who continue to jump on the doors and try to be as loud as possible, it seems, when I'm trying to podcast. So I'm sorry. And I hope you join me for a 4th episode. And until then, have a good evening.